everybody, my name's Dr. Erica Sigurdsson, and welcome to Making History. So I have to be honest, I've been having a really hard time with this video. I intended to write about history and story. You know, like what makes history different from fiction? How do we tell the difference, and what do we do with histories that aren't actually true? I still think those are good questions, but they're big questions and they're very philosophical, which makes it hard to narrow in on anything like specific. So I was having a hard time organizing my thoughts, and I had this thing happen where I would start thinking about the topic. You know, what makes history different from story? What is story? What is truth? And then start to think and overload. But I started thinking about something I read a long time ago, and I hadn't actually thought about in a really long time. It's a history, maybe a very famous history from the 12th century, and something that medievalists sometimes really struggle with. It's called The History of the Kings of Britain. It's important, but it's weird. Is it history? It claims to be. It's structured like a history. It goes through the chronology of the kings of Britain from the early settlements to the Anglo-Saxon invasion, but it also says a lot of things that are not true. So anyway, that seems like a good place to start, right? To think about this question of history and fiction. And one thing I like to do when I'm researching a topic is to check Wikipedia. I know what you're thinking. Not for facts, necessarily. I mean, I will check facts on Wikipedia. But more importantly, I want to know what the consensus view of a topic is. Like if you only check Wikipedia, if you only Google it, what would you know about it? So here's the topic sentence description from Wikipedia of this messy, important, complicated text. Ready? The Historia Regum Britanniae, the history of the kings of Britain, originally called De Gestis Britonum, on the deeds of the Britons, is a pseudo-historical account of British history written around 1136 by Geoffrey of Monmouth. So is that it? Is that just the answer? Is that just the label for that space between fiction and history? Pseudo-history? But something about that isn't fully satisfying to me, and it just keeps sticking in my head. And I think it's that word, pseudo-history. I don't know. I think it needs investigating. So let's do that. Okay, so to figure this out, I think we need to do three things. First, we need a bit more information about the Historia Regum Britanniae. We need to know what it says and why it's considered pseudo-history. Secondly, we need to know a little bit more about the landscape of history writing at that time. So what makes this history so different from other history books of the time? And finally, we need to think through this term pseudo-history. What does it mean? What kind of history qualifies? And are we okay with that? So let's do it. So the History of the Kings of Britain was written around 1136 by an Oxford cleric and teacher, probably a teacher, called Geoffrey of Monmouth. So Geoffrey was born sometime around 1095, and he died in 1155, around the age of 60. His name of Monmouth suggests that he may have been from Monmouth, which is in Wales, but kind of on the border. Now, there's been a huge amount of discussion and debate about his ethnicity. Was he Welsh? Was he Norman? Was he something else? Do those terms even have the same meaning? We don't know. So Geoffrey of Monmouth wrote three things in his life, all very popular and all very weird. So in addition to the history, which we will get to in a second, he published first something called the Prophecies of Merlin, which is very weird and just very mystical sounding, and a narrative poem called The Life of Merlin, which focuses on the life of Merlin as an older man and when he's kind of half crazy from all his prophetic powers. So yeah, we're getting a theme, right? We like Merlin. But his major work, as I said, was the History of the Kings of Britain. So its stated goal was to fill in the history of the Britons. I'm saying that a lot, but it's another way of saying the Celts, the people who lived in Britain before the Angles and Saxons invaded in the 6th century or so. And Geoffrey was right to notice this gap in the historical record. Most existing histories of Britain or England mainly focused on the Anglo-Saxon period, with brief nods to maybe the Roman conquest, Julius Caesar, that kind of time. The only other history to focus on the Britons was an earlier, again, it gets called a pseudo-history by someone called Nennius. Now his history is similar to Geoffrey's, but it's not as well written and it was not very popular. So the History of the Kings of Britain was presenting to its audience totally new material. It was a history that had never been told before. The origin of Britain, the earliest kings. And Geoffrey was a great storyteller. The history is very engaging. It's well structured narratively. It has lots of really good little vignettes, and so it's very engaging. It also includes, for example, the first iteration of the King Lear story. That's a compelling story. We're still staging plays of King Lear. So the History of the Kings of Britain was good writing, and it became incredibly popular. It was circulated all over Europe, it was translated, it was included in compilations of other histories, and it started getting remixed into this whole fictional universe. So Geoffrey of Monmouth's history is the origin of some of the most enduring British legends, and it debuted some of the best-loved kings of the British cinematic universe, most prominently among them, King Arthur. And King Arthur, together with Merlin, his advisor, his wife Guinevere, and his evil nephew Mordred, who are all featured in the history, they're well-known fictional characters, right? From the 12th century to the 21st, we have loved telling and retelling King Arthur stories. Every King Arthur story you've ever heard, every movie or TV show or fantasy novel, whatever it is, they are all essentially Geoffrey of Monmouth fanfic, because the history of the kings of Britain sowed the seeds of that story. But that doesn't quite explain what makes it pseudohistory necessarily, right? I mean, the TV show The Crown is fictional, but that doesn't make Queen Elizabeth a fictional character. We understand that she lived. So there's something more to it. So now let's talk about medieval history standards. Now, I think that nowadays we have a bit of a hard time imagining that people in the Middle Ages, had standards and cared about quality and accuracy in history writing, as with so many other things. It's understandable to a point, because history writing in the Middle Ages did look very different from a history book today. And probably the biggest hurdle for a modern reader is this tendency of medieval historians to try and connect their history, what they're writing with the wider history of the world since the beginning of time, which to a Christian writer often meant Adam and Eve. Or some histories would start their chronology from, again, what we would think of as like legendary or mythological beginnings, like tracing your ancestry to the fall of Troy, which this history does actually. Geoffrey identifies, or makes up, a man called Brutus, who's supposedly the grandson of a Trojan hero named Aeneas. And Brutus becomes the first settler of Britain. It feels weird to us because we know that's not true. Did medieval historians know it wasn't true? I mean, they might have. They did care about truth. They cared about accuracy, and we're going to talk about that in a bit. But they had other goals as well. So medieval histories were supposed to be didactic, meaning they should teach you something. And they were supposed to be moral. They should have a strong moral theme to your history. We see this very clearly, again, in the history of the kings of Britain. When kings lose battles or lose territory, it's because of pride or bad decisions or often petty internal conflicts. Brothers who stand together unite the country. But when brothers fight each other, they lose everything. Finally, medieval histories were supposed to be, this is kind of a technical word, but syncretic. This means they should be able to incorporate and account for other known history, like world history and especially biblical truth. Make it all make sense together. So Geoffrey's history does this sometimes. So for instance, in his account of the wars between the last British kings and the Saxon invaders, he takes previous known history into account to build that story out. But at other times, he very much does not bother with this. And most notably, we can see this in the King Arthur story. So after King Arthur temporarily defeats the Saxons, that part's fine. He then goes on to conquer first a part of France called Brittany, and then he pushes on to defeat the Roman Empire and conquer Rome itself. So other historians of the time noticed the problem. All the other stuff could have happened. There's no other history to corroborate the stories of the early kings of Britain, but they don't directly contradict them either. But there was plenty of history written about the Roman Empire, and none of it includes anything about being conquered by this Celtic King Arthur. And you'd think that would have been mentioned somewhere. So according with other well-respected histories was an important aspect of good history writing in the Middle Ages. But another element of good history is its use of sources. Whether written or oral, primary or secondary, the more careful a historian presents their sources, the more likely it is to be accurate. And medieval historians understood this as well. So one 14th century chronicler writes, "Nothing has been included in this work except what I found in the works of others and in various kinds of document, or more frequently, what I heard related by trustworthy persons or witnessed in person." I like this quote because it really goes through all the different pieces of what could make up a medieval history. So lots of historians from the Middle Ages were having similar discussions within their histories, where they source their information. And we can find out a lot about the information gathering process of medieval historians. Now, the 14th century had more written records. That's the documents that particular person was mentioning. But earlier historians didn't have those to work with. So they much more strongly emphasized trustworthy eyewitnesses. So what makes a trustworthy or reliable witness? 1, elders were considered more reliable than young people. 2, personal experience. The most reliable sources were people who had actually witnessed or experienced the events that were being written about. A third thing that made an eyewitness reliable had to do with their status in society. So most witnesses that were considered trustworthy were men, and most were knights or clerics or somehow all other members of nobility. Okay, so how does this relate back to Geoffrey of Monmouth? Well, Geoffrey claimed to be using as sources the most respected English historians of the time, Bede and Gildas. So Bede especially was understood at that time to be the foremost historian of Anglo-Saxon England. But their histories didn't really cover the period before the Saxon invasions. So for the majority of his history, Geoffrey cites only a very dubious source, a certain very ancient book written in the British language, a book that was supposedly given to him by his friend, the Archdeacon Walter of Oxford. I mean, think about it for a second. Does this book have a name? No. Can I see the book? No. Could I talk to your friend Walter? No. Not a lot of corroboration there, is there? And of course, because this history was from such a far back time period, there was no way for Geoffrey of Monmouth to be working in eyewitnesses, right? Reliable, trustworthy witnesses aren't available for a time period 600 years in the past. So the very ancient book thing is very suspicious. And of course, unlike a lot of his contemporaries, Geoffrey was writing a history of a very long time ago. He couldn't interview eyewitnesses or work off his own memory of events. It's a very different kind of challenge. But still, I mean, he may have worked from at least some Welsh legends, maybe, or oral traditions. It would be nice to know a little bit more about what they were and how he used them. And he chose not to share that information. So finally, we have to deal with this word pseudohistory. It sounds fairly straightforward at first glance. Maybe fake history, right? But what about something like historical fiction? I really liked the novel by Susanna Clarke called Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. It's set in this alternate Regency era, but with magicians and fairies, and the magicians join the Napoleonic War. It's a great book. And one of the stylistic devices that it uses that really stands out for me is how it uses footnotes, which are made up, obviously, and serve to explain the magic system and the lore, but they're written in a style of real 19th century scholarly footnotes. So I'm not sure anyone would say, well, that's pseudohistory. I wouldn't. It's pretty clear from all the other context clues that it's a novel, right? It's a novel that uses some of the trappings of a history book for artistic effect. So I was talking a couple weeks ago about Gothic romances, which are a genre of novel with medieval themes, but also ghosts and spooky old castles. They're very atmospheric. Well, the first Gothic romance, which is called The Castle of Otranto, written in the mid-18th century, it was written by someone called Horace Walpole. And Walpole used this pseudo-historical device where the novel opens with this fake letter, supposedly by the author, saying that he found this ancient manuscript from the 15th or 16th centuries and translated it, and here it is. The translation is the novel. So that wasn't true. But here it gets trickier because the early reading public believed that this was actually a translated medieval story. So they were disappointed when the author's name was put on later translations and he cleared up that it wasn't really an ancient story. So is that pseudohistory? In a modern context, pseudohistory gets defined as history deliberately created with an ideological or propagandistic kind of purpose, right? It looks like history, but it's twisting its evidence and using these bad faith arguments to arrive at incorrect conclusions. One historian defines pseudohistory this way. Pseudohistory uses the trappings of scholarly historical method, footnotes, citations, bibliographies, and primary sources, yet is designed not as a thoughtful analysis intent on discovering insights into the past, but as a subjective arranging of facts. So some obviously dangerous examples of this are things like, history writing that twists its evidence to downplay and deny the extent of the Holocaust, for instance. But other modern pseudohistories aren't necessarily political in quite that way. So I'm old enough to remember how annoyed historians got at Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code, which popularized a pseudo-historical, I guess we could call it a conspiracy theory, that Jesus had children with Mary Magdalene and his descendants were still alive today. Sorry for the spoilers, I guess. So I don't know if that necessarily does the same harm, though, as a Holocaust denier. But it does feel different. It feels in a slightly different category to something like the novel Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, which nobody is particularly believing to be true. We understand it's a novel. So is the history of the kings of Britain a pseudo-history? I mean, maybe. It certainly is structured and presented more like a history than it is like a novel with a few history-ish stylistic elements in it. And it was received as history. While many of Geoffrey's fellow historians hated it and thought it was made-up nonsense, it was taken for real history by most people up until the 16th century or so. I guess maybe my problem with applying this label of pseudo-history to medieval works is that it does feel like a term that is describing two very different things. A medieval legendary history isn't really the same thing as like a present-day Holocaust denier. And a lot of this label rests on the intention of the author, which is something that in the case of the 12th century, we absolutely do not know. Part of what makes Geoffrey of Monmouth and his history so engaging and perplexing to historians even today is it's really hard to tell what his motives were. Was he knowingly misleading readers? Or did he think he was writing genuine history? There's just not enough evidence to say one way or the other. It happens fairly often in history, actually, that we just don't get the most satisfying answer. you know? We don't get the resolution, we don't get the explanation that we really want. Sorry, I know that's not the most satisfying ending, but I think it is the most accurate. Anyway, I think we can continue to think about these questions and continue to talk about, you know, what history is and how it's made. Anyway, thanks very much for listening with me, and I'm really looking forward to talking to you again soon, and I'll see you again next week. Okay, take care, bye-bye.